Today we will be looking at artwork of the High Renaissance and some Mannerist artworks from Northern Europe and Spain of the 1500s. But first, some big ideas. So the huge polarizing event of this time period was the Protestant Reformation, and the Protestant Reformation was a religious movement led by Martin Luther, and he challenged the authority of the Pope and the power of the Catholic Church because he argued that the Catholic Church had become too corrupt. The type of Christianity that Martin Luther was an advocate for emphasized not the power of the Church on earth, but rather the power of God, purely of God, and he encouraged his followers to worship at home, alone, or in simple, very, very simple churches. The Counter-Reformation was led by the Catholic Church, and it was defined by the Council of Trent, and this council defended and defined the Catholic Church in reaction to and against the Protestant Reformation, trying to strengthen their values, even though the Protestant Reformation had seriously attacked them. In this time period, too, we see a tension between Renaissance artwork and mannerism. So mannerism is the kind of less naturalistic and kind of fake-looking style, as opposed to Renaissance artwork, which is more refined and quote-unquote naturalistic. And in artwork, too, we see opposition between Catholic ideas versus Lutheran ideas. Even though Martin Luther himself was from Northern Europe, we'll see that not all Northern European artists moved over to Catholicism. We're going to begin by looking at two examples of Catholic Northern European artwork. And I'm starting with this detail here from a painting by Bosch, which we're about to look at, because I want to just begin by acknowledging that the tone and the humor and the level of detail of artwork from the Northern European Renaissance is quite different from what we were looking at before. Many art historians find the artwork of Northern Europe during the Renaissance to be kind of excessively odd and perhaps even distasteful, but I personally appreciate the humor of it and find it quite charming. This is a triptych by Hieronymus Bosch. It's quite large. It's over 7 feet tall and 6 feet wide, and it would have been placed within a church because it's an altarpiece. So it would have been closed, perhaps for traveling or just so that it could be opened on only important occasions. And the outside here we see an image of God on the upper left there. That's what that detail is of. And God is sitting down looking on the earth, which was, during this time period, believed to be flat, entirely flat, as is portrayed by that orb there, that's the earth. And you open up this altarpiece, and within you are confronted with this, the Garden of Earthly Delights. What exactly the Garden of Earthly Delights portrays is still the subject of much debate. And this sort of mysterious fancifulness of this altarpiece is, again, very characteristic of Northern European Renaissance artwork. But even so, Bosch, in his level of imagination, is something of an outlier, because this is so very far-fetched that no one is even quite sure what it depicts. On the left, there appears to be an image of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and the far right appears to be hell. But the center could perhaps be Earth or something else, maybe all of the figures in it, and there's the figure of the guy putting flowers up the other guy's butt, which is the detail we looked at earlier. Maybe all of those images are somehow metaphorical for the kind of folly that is undertaken here on Earth. Whatever it is, a lot is left up to the viewer to finalize and conclude to themselves, which is a kind of freedom that I, as a viewer, personally quite enjoy. Here is the Eisenheim altarpiece, painted by Matthias Grünewald, and this altarpiece is interesting because it's a great case point for how the placement of an image can often really change the way that an image is made and change its meaning. This is also done as a triptych, so it opens up, and if you look at the hinge where this image opens, you'll see that when you open the piece itself, it's almost as though you're severing the limbs of Christ in both of these images. Here you're cutting off his arm, and here you're cutting off his leg. If you look closer at Christ and see the sort of spotting on his body, you'll see that it looks like he's almost diseased. This altarpiece would have been placed within the chapel of the Hospital of St. Anthony, and most people that went to the Hospital of St. Anthony were dying of ergotism, and ergotism is a disease caused by fungus that grows on rye. These are images of patients with ergotism on the right, and as a result of ergotism, many patients would have to undergo amputation, so their limbs would have to be cut off. And on the left is a detail from the Eisenheim altarpiece when it is opened. So for most of the year, the patients that were suffering from ergotism would be staring at this image here, contemplating Christ that was dying in a way that would remind them of their own pain, and undergoing amputation, as many people in the hospital would. And then it would be opened on special occasions to reveal this image here, a combination of sculpture and painting. That detail from the previous slide is taken from this little rotting demon here on the lower left. And this is an example of the incredible detail, but also imagination. Look at those demons. They seem to be quite modern. They remind me of characters from comics or from movies, even that are from current day. Look at this background up here too. It's very, very imaginative. So although we see this Renaissance interest in detail, we don't see the same sort of Renaissance interest in naturalism, portraying the natural world realistically, as we do see in Southern Europe. Albrecht Dürer is arguably the most famous figure of the Northern Renaissance. He's often referred to as the Leonardo da Vinci of the North. He traveled to Italy, and he took a lot of the ideas that he saw in Italy and adopted them to the Northern European sensibilities. He was extremely successful and influential as a printmaker, and he was a Lutheran, so he was a follower of Martin Luther and a strong advocate of the Protestant Reformation. Like Leonardo da Vinci, Albrecht Dürer kept drawings and journals and sketchbooks, and he drew constantly. Many of his sketches are quite famous, but his praying hands are perhaps the most famous. I've included on the lower left an image of the pop star Justin Bieber with his tattoo of Albrecht Dürer's praying hands. Here is a self-portrait of Dürer. Dürer preferred printmaking over painting, and so much so that some of his contemporaries began to criticize his abilities in painting. So he painted this self-portrait kind of as a display of his virtuosity as a painter. The composition of it might remind you of the Mona Lisa. Again, this is because Dürer had traveled to Southern Europe and adopted some of the ideas of the Italian Renaissance masters for his own compositions and paintings. But the way that he's touching his mink fur coat and the gentle curls of his hair that appear to be coming forward towards the viewer are all a display of his ability to paint magnificent detail. We do have most of Dürer's journals, and in his journal he's quoted as saying, in regards to this painting, that he really disliked painting and found it to be a magnificent waste of time, because with a painting you only have one painting once you're finished with it, whereas with printmaking you have many prints that you can sell many more of, and it's far more lucrative and productive than painting is. Printmaking, just a little refresher if you've forgotten, it's a form of creating multiple images using a printing press, and a printing press is that machine that's pictured on the far right. Albrecht Dürer came from a family of goldsmiths, so people who worked with gold, carved gold. So he was very familiar with different forms of manipulating metal and also wood, and he used his training as a goldsmith to create very intricate engravings onto metal. Here's one of his engravings. Before the time of Albrecht Dürer, printmaking wasn't a very respected art form. He really revolutionized that, and the people were extremely interested in his prints, and they sold for quite a lot of money, which would have been very uncharacteristic. Most prints would have sold very cheaply, but his were fetching prices that were unheard of up to this point. Critics of the day said that he was able to achieve the sort of tonality and attention to detail and texture with just a black and white line that most painters couldn't achieve even with a full palette of color. I think that's especially true of this engraving here, Night, Death, and the Devil. Keep in mind that this is a relatively small image. It's about the size of just your regular sheet of copy paper, and all of the detail in it was carved by hand with a little chisel onto copper. Oftentimes these were carved with the use of a magnifying glass so that each line could be seen perfectly. And then it would have been additioned, so many prints of it would be pulled so that people could, like a number of people could own it. There wouldn't be just one that exists. Here is one of his images of the apocalypse, and unlike the previous one, this one would have been carved into wood. Just a note on how our relationship to fine art is different than the relationship to fine art that many people would have had during this time period. Many of the prints of the Four Horsemen that exist today have been colored in, because people who bought it would have thought that it needed a little bit of color and would have added that with watercolor. And there is an example of a hand-colored print on the right. Now you can see that in all of these images there's less of an emphasis on public religious devotion than in the imagery that we've seen before. And that is, of course, a reflection of the Protestant Reformation. So the Council of Trent was the Catholic rebuttal of the Protestant Reformation, but the Protestant Reformation was led by Martin Luther, the guy on the left there, pictured with his wife, and he objected specifically to indulgences, and indulgences were practiced by the Catholic Church, where people were encouraged to pay money for a little sheet of paper called an indulgence that would have been signed by the Pope, and that was supposed to free you from your sins and guarantee your way into heaven. You could also buy them for loved ones who died. So essentially it was just a way of paying money to get into heaven. And Martin Luther argued that this was corrupt and not true to the Bible at all. He came up with 95 theses, ideas, in 1517 that were against the Catholic Church and described the Church as he believed it needed to be reformed. The outcome of the Protestant Reformation was that Lutheranism became a new sect of Christianity, and the Bible, which had previously only been available in Latin, was translated into commonly spoken languages so that people could read it and could worship at home. Another result of the Protestant Reformation was iconoclasm, the move towards iconoclasm that happened during this time period, which was the objection of and the destruction of religious imagery. And in rare cases did it actually result in destruction of religious imagery, but we'll see a rise of imagery that isn't religious in nature as a result of Lutheranism. Here is a detail of a non-religious painting from Northern Europe. And I'm including this detail because the detail gets lost when you look at the overall image, but it is painted with incredible detail. This is the image. It's the Battle of Issus by Albrecht Dürer, and it seems to contain everything. The Battle of Issus was a ancient fight against the Greeks versus the Persians, and the Greeks won. And this here, though, is about more than just the battle. It's also about the landscape, and it's also about the cosmos itself. When you think of the Battle of Issus metaphorically, it's a battle against Greece, which was aligned with the Western world, and the Persians, which are aligned with the Eastern world. So in some ways it could be seen as a metaphor for the Crusades. But everything about this image is metaphoric. Nothing about it is openly religious or openly one thing or the other, and that is a outcome of the Protestant Reformation, as is the emphasis on the natural world. So this artist was trying to display his virtuosity as a painter, just as the artists that we saw of the Italian High Renaissance were, but his subject isn't divine, because he isn't painting for the Catholic Church. This is a detail from another image that I happen to really love. I always love images that are slightly humorous. This painting that we're about to look at is a painting that illustrates proverbs. And proverbs are popular sayings that contain a truth or a piece of advice. Like, man, I should have thought of one before this, but let's see. Cat got your tongue would be an example, I guess, of a proverb in English. Here's a proverb from Northern Europe. She was so stubborn she could even tie the devil to a pillow, so she could do absolutely anything, and here's an illustration of it. Here is the painting in its entirety, and there are over 40 proverbs that are illustrated by this painting. This is, again, a very not religious painting in its subject matter, and I encourage you to go online. You can easily find an explanation of all of the proverbs that are illustrated by this wonderful image. Let's briefly look at some Spanish artwork during this time period. Spanish culture was very staunchly Catholic and remained so despite the Protestant Reformation. We're going to look at the work of El Greco, and El Greco was a mannerist. Some of the basic features of mannerism, as we discussed last time, are the elongated figures, the lack of emphasis on balance and rationality and symmetry, unusual lighting, a move away from naturalism, and the figura serpentinata, which is the figures that look kind of snake-like in their form. When I say snake-like in their form, I mean elongated, so look at how unnaturally long the figure of this saint appears to be, and look at how openly Catholic this image is, although it needn't necessarily be. It's about the burial of a count, but we see the inclusion of figures from the Catholic Church and saints presiding over the funeral. Everything is painted with a heightened sense of drama, of lighting, and this heightened sense of drama we'll see carried throughout artwork of Spain, even when we look at artwork in a following module that is only from Spain. And even the way that the landscape is painted by El Greco is heightened, elongated. It's moving away from naturalism and towards a sort of abstraction and emotional style of painting that we're going to see carried on by future artists, but not for a couple centuries later do I feel like this kind of expressionism that's reached in the work of El Greco is again mastered by artists. He's far ahead of his time. And that concludes this lecture.